Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Thank you for joining us for this week's presentation. If you'd like to learn more about applying for the Rehabilitation Counseling Education Master's Program or the Rehabilitation and Addiction Counseling Master's Program at St. Cloud State University, please email rce@stcloudstate.edu. Applications are currently being accepted for the fall 2021 term. If you would like to watch the recorded version of this presentation or prior presentations, please visit our YouTube channel by searching for St. Cloud State University Rehabilitation Studies on YouTube. Welcome to the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. The event will begin shortly. Thank you for joining us for this week's presentation. If you'd like to learn more about applying for the Rehabilitation Counseling Education Master's Program or the Rehabilitation and Addiction Counseling Master's Program at St. Cloud State University, please email rce@stcloudstate.edu. Applications are currently being accepted for the fall 2021 term.
This week's speaker series. I am Graham, along with my co-host Sarah, and this week we'll be talking with Ann Cody. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. And I am wondering if you would like to open by just telling us a little bit about your story.
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
So my name is Ann Cody, and I live and work in Washington, D.C. I work for the federal government in the foreign policy arena at the State Department. I have the distinct pleasure of working on international disability rights and really helping lift up people with disabilities in other parts of the world who are still really trying to tear down those barriers that we've experienced in our history, and share our expertise as well, since we've got a lot of experience with doing legislation that works and some of the things that don't work. So that's really important, and I love my job. I'm married. I have one stepson, one kitty cat, and I am a Paralympic athlete from the 84, 88, and 92 Paralympic Games, the Summer Games. I was a wheelchair basketball athlete on the women's national team early in my career, and then did road racing and track for many years. Ran a couple of races up in your neck of the woods in Minnesota when I was competing as an athlete. So sport is a big part of my background. Also, I grew up on a farm in upstate New York. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. We have been talking with everybody just kind of about their history with disability and what has helped them to overcome through their challenges and some of the things that they've faced. And obviously with competing in, I would say, earlier years, obviously I'm sure that you faced a lot more challenges than we do today. Do you mind sharing at all about some of those experiences that you've had?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. It's funny when I get together with friends with disabilities, especially similar disabilities, wheelchair users in particular. We like to tell stories and try to see who has the most challenging story in terms of what they've experienced. But yeah, 40 some years ago when I acquired my disability, I was 16 years old. I was a junior in high school, and I had transverse myelitis, which basically means the myelin sheath around the spinal cord is damaged and causes paralysis, very similar to a traumatic spinal cord injury. And I'm a T5/6 paraplegic. So we didn't have the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Rehabilitation Act was in place, and the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act was in place. So I was able to return to my high school and finish my K-12 education, which was actually in question because the high school was not accessible and they had to make modifications in order for me to finish my my schoolwork and graduate on time. But we were able to do that, and we were able to use the law to ensure that it was done, because they wanted to send me to a segregated school, even though I had always been in the accelerated program all the way through. So, and then accessibility wise, nothing was accessible. There were very few ramps and elevators and curb cuts, no curb cuts really at that time for wheelchair riders.
And thank you so much for sharing that. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the background surrounding your injury, if you don't mind, just maybe some of the major changes that you saw before and after.
Before and after my disability?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in the way people interacted with me, or
yeah, especially like at school or with family and friends.
Yeah. Well, I had a really fantastic network of people around me. And, some of that is because I was playing sports, I was playing organized sports. This was post Title IX. So we had lots of opportunities to play organized competitive sports. So my classmates and teammates and I were really close. And so those relationships were really important and essential for me to, in my recovery and return to school, because I was really nervous about it going back, as a seriously disabled person compared to being, one of the top athletes in the girls sports program. The other really important relationship was my coach, my high school coach, who was also our physical education teacher and athletic director. And she did research while I was in the hospital to figure out what kind of sports I could still do. So when I returned home and started going back to school, I actually had an independent study PE class with her, because I had to drop one of my classes because I'd missed too much of the school year to pick it up again. But so she did weight training with me, because that was something I still needed to do to get stronger. We tried archery, shooting baskets, just pushing my everyday chair around outside to kind of get some distance in and stuff. So she really wanted to set that, tone for me. It was so critically important for me to know that there were sports activities that I could do. I didn't really know what they looked like or that they were as competitive as they were, but it was a big help. And then my family too. Everybody just, surrounded me and my parents and my brothers and gave us a lot of support. So all of that was so important to my kind of recovery, rehabilitation, and then entry back into school.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely wonderful to hear that even while you were in the hospital, you had somebody that was kind of advocating for you to continue with your sports career, because it sounds like that was something that was very important to you. As far as going into post-secondary and receiving your secondary education, was there any additional challenges that you faced?
Yeah, well, this will interest you, I think. So I applied for some services, right, that I was eligible for as a disabled young person, and rehabilitation counseling services was one of those things. And so I had to have a conversation with my rehab counselor, because she was looking for rightfully what she was supposed to do, opportunities for me to train in something that would enable me to get work once I graduated from high school. And so, she found like a 6-month program in CAD design, because art and design was something I was interested in. And I said, I'm not interested in that. I've always planned to go to college. I still want to go to college. In fact, I have to have a degree now, because there aren't a lot of jobs with high school education that I can do. So anyway, so she obviously that convinced her, since I was so adamant about it. So I had support. So I had some financial support, basically, to go to college. And I was searching. Back then, we didn't have the internet, so I was searching through catalogs with tiny little descriptions, like you read in the wanted section of the newspaper, for each university. And my mom worked in the medical field. She was a nurse, and she was asking people if they knew of any campuses or colleges around the country that were wheelchair accessible or that had sports programs. And so a couple of them came up, and one was the University of Illinois. And so I wrote to the University of Illinois and all these other schools that people mentioned that might have programs. And the only one I heard back from was Illinois. And I scheduled a visit to go out there and visit the campus. Meanwhile, I growing up in upstate New York, I visited Syracuse University, Cornell, and all the SUNY schools in the upstate region. And none of them were accessible or could be made readily accessible in time for me to start my freshman year. So then I visited Illinois' campus, and just, it was fully accessible. This is 1981. And they had, it's a huge campus. At that time, there were 40,000 undergraduate students, I believe. And they had buses specifically for the students with disabilities, accessible lift buses. So it was hands down the most accessible Mecca that you could imagine. And they had competitive sports programs. In fact, their men's and women's wheelchair basketball teams were actually varsity sports. So the athletes earned varsity letters from the University of Illinois. And I was just so impressed and surprised pleasantly with that. And they had other programs too, swimming, track and field, so it was just where I needed to be.
Yeah, that sounds like a great outlet, great school to be going to, especially at that time. It's honestly, to me, really frustrating to hear that you had such a challenge finding a school that had accessibility. I know that we've come a long way, at least recently, that I've noticed with accessibility services for disabilities. Not necessarily accessibility, but just the technology and services that they have for people with learning disabilities has just come such a long way.
Yeah.
And it's so great to hear that you did find a school that was fully accessible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
And can you tell us a little bit how, I know you said you were played sports in college, but how did you go from college to the Paralympics? Can you tell us a little bit of that story?
Sure, yeah. Well, I found out that the Paralympics existed when I was in rehabilitation. One of the nurses told me about it because there was a gentleman from Syracuse, which is where I was doing my rehabilitation program, who had been to the Paralympics as a swimmer. So that was kind of when I first heard about it. And then when I got to campus my freshman year, I met several athletes who'd competed in the Paralympic Games. And, kind of thought that's really interesting. And the coaches at Illinois were really top coaches in the country as well. So I just kind of, set my goals on maybe making the women's national team in basketball somewhere in those 4 years, that I was there as an athlete, see how far I could go. So I really, took every opportunity to learn, to train, to learn how to play basketball in a wheelchair, to develop the strength and endurance and speed to be able to play the sport at a high level. And then I started doing wheelchair racing, road races, mostly local 10Ks and things in the off season, just for fun and for fitness. So I made the women's national team in 83, and then 84 at the Paralympic Games. And then when I came home from the 84 Games, I started doing the road racing and set a goal of doing a marathon in wheelchair racing, and really discovered that was a much better fit for me as an athlete, like physiologically and physically and structurally and everything. So I really started to pursue that. And all the time I was going to school, and I was, I was working out with teammates and other folks other wheelchair users my age who also had similar goals. And we had role models, like I said, athletes who had competed in the games who were really high level athletes. And then our coaches, actually, they were early in their careers, but they became US coaches in their sports. So it was quite a really exciting time to be at Illinois and to be in the wheelchair sports field, because there was a lot of exciting development going on.
Yeah, that sounds like such a great drive that you had to push yourself and to overcome the challenges that you faced. It's really impressive to hear your story, and so wonderful for you to share it with us.
Thanks.
I'm wondering about how your transition worked with going from your sports career and transitioning into legislation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, yeah. So I, after the '92 Paralympic Games in Barcelona, I was ready to start my professional career and looking for opportunities. And Atlanta, Georgia had been named the host for the '96 Paralympic Games. So I moved to Georgia. I got a job and moved to Georgia to be closer to the action and really have that unique experience. And then was hired by the organizing committee to be the sports and venues planning manager. As far as legislation goes, we were the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted in 1990. And this was around 1992. So it was very early in the implementation process. So we were doing a lot. We were being educated on what the law, says and what it does and what it will do. So then we were educating people in the organizing committee because we were, some of the sports venues were being built, the sports venues and the practice sites. So they had to be, and actually the Paralyzed Veterans of America had to file a lawsuit against the Olympic Organizing Committee because the venues were being built without ADA, that were not ADA compliant. So they made sure that happened. And we made sure that in the interior design of the facilities that it would work for Paralympic athletes, Paralympic spectators, officials, media, people with disabilities in all aspects of the games. So it was pretty amazing to be part of that.
And can you tell us a little bit about just in your job, a lot of us are going to school to be voc rehab counselors, and I'm wondering if you can tell me if you've had experiences with VR services and kind of how that went for you?
Yep, sure. Yes, I did. And that was really early on. After I got released from the hospital, it was one of the first services that I had available to me. And the rehab counselor, came and met with me at school, and we talked about my interests and where I excelled in the curriculum at school. And I told her sports and the arts because I was studying visual arts. So that was one of my areas of interest. So I mentioned this earlier. So she looked into, and I should say that at that time in a rural school community in upstate New York, only about 20% of graduates went to college. It was a really low percentage rate. So she was looking at what could I do with art skills that would enable me to have the greatest likelihood of getting a job. So she presented like a 6-month CAD drawing. CAD stands for some kind of digital drawing. It was basically what architects use to draw plans and things and floor plans. So, but I told her that I plan to go to college and get a 4-year degree. And that's what I still wanted to do. I didn't know exactly where I would be able to go and, whether or not there was a school that was accessible, but that's what that was my goal. And that was also what I needed to do as a paraplegic in order to be able to be employable. So, so she worked with me and we worked together for, I guess, 4 to 6 years, really, because she followed me all through my undergraduate program. she checked in to see how I was doing at the end of each year, academically and psychologically and everything, especially because I grew up in upstate New York and I went to school in Champaign, Illinois. I was quite a distance from home. So I imagine there was a little bit of nervousness about that and how that would turn out. And I was studying art. So she was also worried about how I was going to get a job, as were my parents. But I did end up getting a full-time job after my undergraduate degree at the local Air Force Base as a graphic artist. So I worked in the arts field for about 2.5 years before I went back to graduate school to get a degree in therapeutic recreation, which enabled me to work in the adaptive sports field from there on out. Yeah, so it was a good experience. I had to, so as an out-of-state student in Illinois, I had to pay triple the tuition rate. And New York State provided me with what they would have paid for in-state tuition, which covered about 1/3 of the cost of going to Illinois. So I took out student loans and spent many years paying them back, but it was totally worth every penny of that. Yeah.
Oh, that's really great to hear about the assistance part, as far as supporting you financially as well. I guess I didn't really know that was even really a program until I became disabled when I was overseas. I served in the Army. And I actually use Voc Rehab Services now to do my graduate program in vocational rehabilitation. So
Awesome.
it's so wonderful to hear that you were able to get so much support throughout the whole process, including that whole 6-year span of getting your education.
Yeah, it was great, really helpful.
Let's see here. Sarah, did you have any additional questions that you could think of right now?
I do. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about maybe some of the misconceptions or stigma surrounding spinal cord injuries.
Sure. I think that, so there's a perception that everybody with a spinal cord injury is paralyzed from the waist down or the chest down. Those are common, descriptors. When some people are quadriplegics, which you will hear them described as from the neck down. But there are varying degrees of paralysis with people with spinal cord injuries, and some people, maybe if they have a very low damage down near the sacrum area or the lumbar area, they could potentially walk, with orthotics and canes and things like that. So people get surprised, right, if someone stands up from their chair and puts their chair in their vehicle. And then other times they wonder why someone who's paralyzed can't do similar things. So there's kind of a misunderstanding, I think, about that. And then everybody's different. Even if you have the same level of injury or that's been affected, people deal with it differently, and it affects your body differently too, potentially, depending on where the nerves innervate at the spinal cord. You could have a higher level or a lower level injury than the other person. Let's see, what else? I think there's always, 40 years ago, people would talk to me also like I maybe had an intellectual disability or a hearing impairment. So they would talk in a higher, they would talk louder, or they would talk to another thing that was common, I think it still might be in some places, is the person would address the non-disabled person who is with me especially when I was younger and I was with an adult. But even when I was with peers, they wouldn't address me directly. They would ask, what does she want? Or, what can I get her, instead of talking to me directly. So a lot of questions that I get, especially from young people, is how do you sleep in your chair? Because they're trying to understand, like, how much of the time does she stay in that thing if she's paralyzed? And so just educating them, right, about, well, I transfer into the bed and sleep in the bed, and into the shower using a bench and things like that, just helping. So if they've never known someone with paralysis, it is really, it's this concept that they just, haven't experienced, which is totally understandable, right? I mean, the rate of spinal cord injury is pretty low compared to the large population that we have in the US. Let's see, what else? So there's also a question about, and this depends on the injury level too. Some of us have what we call complete spinal cord injury, which cuts across the entire spinal cord. So both the motor nerves and the sensory nerves are damaged. So sensation is completely cut off at the level of innervation. And some people have incomplete injuries, which also could cause them to be able to walk. Even if they have a cervical level injury, a neck level injury, they might be incomplete and be able to walk, but have some dysfunction in their hands and arms. And they might have complete sensation. Yeah, so everybody's very unique in those ways. And some people use power wheelchairs and some people use manual wheelchairs. So that usually is dependent on the level of paralysis.
I think that's really, well, interesting, but also I'm sure it was really frustrating to have people, address others that you were with thinking that there was an intellectual delay there. Did you find that as you got older that changed a little bit? Or is that something you still encounter? Yeah,
it's changed a lot. I've experienced so much change in the past 30 years. Since the ADA was enacted. So I'm also, I'm older, so that might be part of it too, but definitely don't hear that or get that as much. I've done a lot of international travel, and in countries where they're still trying to establish national disability rights laws and implement them, the stigma around disability is so heavy that you see some of those things happening, in those countries, and people with disabilities being frustrated by that. So, so it's interesting, right, to see those patterns and the consistency of that. But things have changed here a lot. I think the ADA, has made us more visible, people with disabilities, and it's driven so much education and awareness about disability. That things are much better.
Absolutely. You mentioned something about when you shower, is there any like assistive technology or anything that you can talk about that you use?
Sure. So we have just a standard bathroom in our apartment, and with a tub, and we use a shower bench. So it's a padded bench that has like a transfer piece to extension that goes outside the tub, which makes it easier to transfer from your wheelchair into the shower. And it has a seat back as well, because I don't have good balance because of my level of paralysis. So I transfer into that. If I need help, I use a sliding board, which is a wooden board that you use when you're learning how to transfer. And some people rely on it all the time because it's a safer way to transfer if you don't have the upper body strength to physically lift yourself from one position to another. So that's but there are shower benches that have some design in them so that once you transfer to that external seat side, it'll actually slide into the shower. And then there are also roll-in showers that you could roll into if you're using a water-resistant wheelchair, which is usually like a shower chair. So some people use that. Just it depends on your function and mobility, usually. But and then we use a handheld shower nozzle so that we can control where the water's going because we can't reach too high.
Wonderful. Sarah, it looks like we have a question in the Q&A portion. Do you mind reading that?
Oh, yeah, of course.
My eyes are bothering me.
So the question that we have is, this is a very broad question, but I'm wondering if you can speak to how you see intersectionally Paralympics or disability advocacy now versus in the 1980s. What I mean by this is, what is the level of cooperation and interconnection among individuals with disabilities who are white, people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, immigration status, socioeconomic class, etc.?
So I can tell you that it's getting better. Still has a long way to go in terms of us working across, across coalitions and across other marginalized groups. An example is at the State Department. I work in the Human Rights Bureau on international disability rights, and one of my team members is the expert on LGBTQI. And the rights of that we are promoting for them, and also Indigenous peoples is another area that we focus on, and obviously gender and women's issues as well are a focus of the State Department. So we all work together and collaborate whenever possible, and we also write grant notice of funding opportunities that are designed to actually encourage that kind of cooperation. So we'll write a grant that targets both LGBTQI plus persons and persons with disabilities, so that we can bring those two parties together and have them work together. Now, I've also noticed that the leaders that are coming up today in the disability rights community are very much, they live at the intersection of disability and color, or disability and sexual orientation. So they're also making sure that the cross collaboration is happening. So that's really good to see, and it's important.
Are there specific things in society that you wish would change or you feel could be improved upon, just regarding people with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, yeah. I mean the stigma is we still experience that to a lesser degree, but it's still there. And I think we see it in employment. The employment rates of persons with disabilities are really low in this country, and the ADA was designed actually to address that. And that's the one area that we haven't seen a lot of improvement in. The employment rate has remained the same at around 25% up to 50%, depending on which part of the disability population you look at. And the driver of that is stigma and discrimination, just thinking that people with disabilities aren't as capable and wouldn't be as reliable. And, so that's really the area that we need to tackle and continue to shape in a more positive way. And because of where I sit in the work that I do, I get to see patterns, and that is the biggest one. It's massive, the stigma that people with disabilities face, and it's really overwhelming in many countries, because it really affects every aspect of a person's life and what they want to do and what they're trying to do, especially if they're advocating for legislation to establish the rights of, their rights and start to eliminate the barriers. The stigma is the biggest barrier, and it's the hardest one to break down. So I think, that is probably what I would like to see change.
Do you think that is also a reflection of accessibility to services, especially in like rural communities here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because I notice in larger cities like Washington and places where people have maybe gone away to college or at least been exposed to other people outside of their communities, they're definitely more aware, right, that of how far we've come, and that people with disabilities do work and do have children and do, own their own homes. And yes, there are people with disabilities who also, live in settings where they have assistance in order to live in the most independent, community-based way possible. But yeah, in rural communities, it takes a little more time for people to adjust, and because they just don't see us, we're not as visible.
Right.
So to your point, yeah, that's missing.
It's
so
asked
important,
that specifically because you were in a rural community.
Yeah.
Growing up, so.
Yeah, that's right.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Sarah, it looks like we have another question, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. And I just want to say too, if there's anyone in the audience that has questions, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Okay, so this question is, did Voc Rehab help you with home modifications, or did you have to solve those challenges yourself? Talk about what kinds of home modifications, accommodations to have in your present home.
Okay. I actually don't remember. So we did have to modify my family's home in order for me to go home from rehab. But I know it's possible that vocational rehab covered it, but I'm not sure, to be honest. We did have to have the physical therapist and the occupational therapist go and visit the home and make recommendations, because my bedroom was on the second story of the house. It's an old farmhouse built in the 1860s, so it was so it definitely wasn't built for accessibility modifications, but my family had a ramp built from the driveway up to the side entrance to the house, and then we moved my bedroom downstairs into the formal living room, and then created a door into the bathroom, a door that kind of opened both ways that I could just push with my chair. So this was kind of a modification. It was a wider door entrance, and I could just push my chair and it would open. So they also increased the size of the bathroom and moved. So they basically had to gut the bathroom and redesign it and move some walls around. But that was all done during the time that I was in rehab. They kept the bathtub, and we used the shower bench, which was working well for me. And they had a sink put in that had the cutout underneath the pipes, or directly underneath the sink. It was cut out wide enough so my wheelchair could fit under it. So I could kind of roll under the sink and use it, as opposed to pull up alongside a cabinet. So that was an important modification. And then the toilet was a raised toilet, a higher toilet than the standard height. And then the second door, so there were 2 doors to the bathroom. The second door was modified too, so that it was wide enough for my wheelchair to get through. I think those were the primary modifications that we made to the house so it could function for me. And I knew I was going away to college after graduation and stuff, so we didn't need to. There wasn't a whole lot more to do actually at that point. So, yeah.
Were
I'm
those?
wondering
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Graham.
I'm wondering if there was any sort of accommodations within the community, such as like religious services or just any general public settings so that you could have access to those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our church that we belong to had been recently built. They built a new church, and it was built with accessibility, standards. I think they must have used Architectural Barriers Act standards. Thankfully, I'm not sure. I don't think there was a curb cut onto the sidewalk, so that was missing, and there wasn't an accessible parking space because those weren't required necessarily, unless you had federal funds. So, but yeah, the rest, getting into the church and everything else was fully accessible. The library was one that was kind of a discussion about the need to make it accessible when they were renovating the front portion of it. So I think the fact that even though I was in college, I think the fact that I was, a resident of the town made it possible and kind of put pressure on them to restructure it so that it would be accessible. So that happened. Not a lot of other things though.
Well, I do have a few more in the Q&A that came up, but what I was going to ask is that when someone has something happen like you did where you need to make modifications to your home, are you responsible for the cost of that? What happens if people can't afford to do those things to their home?
So I think we were responsible for it because I say that because my uncle at the time owned a cement company, and he came, and my dad is a civil engineer, so they designed the ramp and then poured the concrete for it. So it was, and I imagine my parents probably paid for the modifications inside too. I don't recall them getting funding to do that. Yeah, I mean, and then the medical costs too, right? I mean, we had really good insurance, but there was the cost, the cost of a catastrophic illness like that is significant. So I think they probably had to go into their savings, to address some of that. And I know from working in the disability field, what happens, nowadays is people end up being put in nursing homes if there's no family who can take them, because for a whole variety of reasons, but a lot of times it's because accessibility is cost prohibitive, right, for them to make. So that's the worst case scenario, that you end up in a nursing home, because then it's really hard to get out, essentially. And that's not an environment that a young person should be in.
No, definitely not. I can't imagine what that would be like for a young person to be in a nursing home, because that was really the only option they had.
Yeah. It's and the person's benefits, Social Security benefits and Medicaid benefits, just go straight to the nursing home to pay for those costs. So you just don't have any control or autonomy is my understanding. So yeah, it's not a good option.
Okay, so a couple more questions here. One of them is, what role do you see in higher educators or psychologists in particular, speaking from a psychologist, playing in dismantling this stigma?
Gosh. Yeah, that's a good question, because there's such a, it's like, I think there's a need to, it's hard, right, to think about, yes, we can touch individuals and classes and maybe an entire field of practitioners, right, through, by educating them, giving them more information so that they can start to break down those barriers of stigma. But it's really the general population, some mass media is one way that we think of to try to do it. And it's got to be consistent messaging and imagery through the media. So I know the disability rights community is working hard with people in LA and Hollywood and in New York in the arts and entertainment field to really try to ensure that people with disabilities are represented in advertising and television and in movies and such, to kind of help desensitize people, or whatever it is, for people, to get people used to seeing us as regular part of the community so that we're not so invisible. So I think thinking about ways that you can help make us visible and our challenges, but also our potential contributions, to our communities and to the broader society as well, because those are missing, when only 25% of us are in the workforce. That means there's so much poverty and invisibility and isolation happening. So we're not really utilizing the strengths and skills and benefits that people with disabilities bring.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges that you may have faced, just mentally trying to cope with that stigma that you're like lesser of a person, or not, having like intellectual disabilities and stuff like that. I'm sure there was a lot of changes, especially being a young person facing a disability. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about any of the services that you received to kind of cope with that, or some of the skills that you may have built, or something that we could maybe implement in the field ourselves as we begin to work with people with disabilities.
Great. Well, I will say this at the outset. I did not have counseling when I was in rehabilitation. And I think that's a mistake. I think counseling for someone who goes through experiences a catastrophic injury or illness is absolutely important. And also the family, the immediate family members who are so impacted by what's happened and what is going, and what it's going to take also to help the family member get back to full capacity, or whatever that looks like. So that's really important. I would want to push for that in any rehabilitation setting or community setting where someone needs to have access. Let's see what else. I had another thought I wanted to share on that. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question so it'll trigger?
Sorry, my brain doesn't function like it's
Got it.
supposed to either. um, just maybe some general pointers that we can use in rehabilitation services
Yeah.
for working with people with disabilities, especially with
Oh,
spinal
yeah.
cord injuries.
Yeah, now I remember too. You were asking me what it was like and what sort of skills or tools did I use or rely on to adjust, basically the adjustment, right? I think I mean, I always go back to sport because sport is such a grounding um, identity and thing for me. So that was really important to know that I had that again and to get back into it as early as possible made a huge difference for me. Also being able to, to talk and express myself and my frustrations, to the people around me. When I needed support, I had people that I could talk to. The other thing that sport did was it put me in contact with people my age who had similar disabilities and, acquired them either, at birth or, somewhere along the way. And so I learned a lot from them. And those were a group of people that I could share things with because they understood. We had that shared lived experience that our family members and other teammates didn't have. So it was really important. So there was a support system and also, a peer mentorship going on, both around the emotional, psychological issues, but also the physical, like how do you do wheelies in a wheelchair so that you can safely get off the curb or onto the curb where there isn't a curb cut, because back then there were not many curb cuts in the world. So you did have to learn some skills and tools with your chair. So all of that was just, so important. So those are the things that I did.
Sarah, it looks like we have one more question. We're getting pretty close to our time. If you want to go ahead and
Yes. So someone wants to know, in your travels, what positive things have you taken from other countries in terms of work they're doing to improve access for people with disabilities?
So what's really interesting is while the US has been a leader in disability rights work, we've also seen other countries achieve and actually accelerate the work that's being done. So a country like Australia has a really interesting program where it's a government program to get people with disabilities into employment. The specifics of it, I can't, the mechanics of it, I can't share with you necessarily, but it is very innovative. And it's, it's something that we haven't tried, but it's a very targeted effort to take people with disabilities from where they are to employment, and using government funding to do that. I think they're looking at like work hardening type programs. Sports is a good example, right? People with disabilities who are competing in sports are especially organized sports, are developing skills that are immediately transferable to the workplace. And they obviously are goal setters and time managers and things like that. So getting them to think about, shifting that to what could you do for employment or for a career. So there, anyway, sorry, I can't describe it more specifically, but that's one thing to look at for sure. And the United Kingdom as well. They provide a stronger safety net for people with disabilities in the UK. I don't know if we've done much research to understand how, whether or not that makes a difference in terms of people being able to get employed. or avoid poverty or nursing homes and things like that. But it certainly seems like it does keep people out of institutions. So, and there are countries that are, that are more in the developing side who are doing innovative things too, and they're they're wanting to learn from us and the Australians and the British, so that they can not make the same mistakes that we made and really accelerate. There's a women with disabilities movement in Pakistan that, and actually an independent living movement in Pakistan that really benefited from the US independent living movement, which is where that movement started. But they're doing an amazing job of bringing visibility to the rights and needs of girls and women with disabilities. They're very active, very visible, respected. So that's really exciting to see. Yeah.
Is there any current legislation that we have going on to kind of help to get gainful employment for persons with disabilities?
The Americans with Disabilities Act was amended in 1998. Is that the right year? No, 2008. 2008 to really further define who is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the courts had really tried to make it much narrower. But the intent of the law was to protect the broadest possible group of people with disabilities. So in that respect, that was an effort to really try to, again, protect people from discrimination. Because even if you have a minor disability, but people are aware of it and judge your ability based on it, then that's going to impact your ability to be employed or to be to advance in your work. So that was a major change or major effort to try to do more. There are programs, certainly, grant programs that people are using, and also the private sector. There's something called Disability In, which is an organization of companies that are including people with disabilities in their diversity and inclusion efforts. And they're actually they've actually made it one of the priorities of their diversity and inclusion work to hire more people with disabilities, to accommodate them, to benefit from, our skills and expertise and so forth. And that is a growing field. And there's a woman in the UK who started something called the Valuable 500, I think, which is she's working to put together a coalition of 500 CEOs or CEOs of Fortune 500 companies to do something similar, to say, people with disabilities have something to contribute. Here's the research. They're actually, high contributors at work. They're actually highly reliable. They take less sick days. They're more loyal. They're less likely to change jobs once you've trained them to do the work, to be successful. So certainly those really give me a lot of encouragement, because that's, those are the folks who employ so much of the population and the supply chains, right? The small businesses that supply those large corporations as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we are out of time. It was so wonderful for you to share your story with us and answer some questions. I want to thank you again for participating.
My
and
pleasure.
Again, we just really appreciate you providing your input. Sarah, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, and thank you so much for answering all our questions.
Mhm.
And then I just want to thank the ASL interpreters as well. And then just for the audience, I just want to remind you to join us next week at 8 a.m. for a book talk with Paralympic gold and bronze medalist Mallory Weggemann. I hope I'm saying that right. She'll be facilitating an author's discussion on her book Limitless. And Anne, thank you again. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank
Thank you for watching the Rehabilitation Studies Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us for this week's presentation. If you'd like to learn more about applying for the Rehabilitation Counseling Education Master's Program or the Rehabilitation and Addiction Counseling Master's Program at St. Cloud State University, please email rce@stcloudstate.edu. Applications are currently being accepted for the fall 2021 term. If you would like to watch the recorded version of this presentation or prior presentations, please visit our YouTube channel by searching for St. Cloud State University Rehabilitation Studies on YouTube.